Hi everyone, and welcome to the speed learning series on ServiceNow Risk Management. In each session, we'll share quick, focused insights to help you get the most out of the platform. In this session, we'll focus on the advanced risk scoring capability, a critical feature of the advanced risk assessments application. Let's get started. As a quick refresher, advanced risk, a key application of the integrated risk management IRM suite, helps organizations manage a wide spectrum of risks, including enterprise, operational, and IT risks. At the core of advanced risk is its risk assessment methodology, or RAM, a flexible, configurable engine that supports risk assessments and enables structured, consistent, and repeatable evaluation of risks. It is the RAMs that let you not only design tailored risk assessments, but also incorporate quantitative and qualitative risk scores and sets the stage for roll-ups across organizational entities and risk taxonomy. That is the very focus of our session, risk scoring. Without further ado, let's look at the agenda of what's planned for the session. Let's review what we'll cover today. Prerequisites. We'll cover foundational knowledge you need for easier adoption. User personas. The advanced risk administrator role is important since the risk scoring configuration lives within the RAM. Introduction. What risk scoring means and why it matters. Key terminology. We'll review the shared vocabulary, such as inherent, residual, target, and other terms we'll use throughout. High-level approach. The end-to-end conceptual flow. Risk scoring details. The core of our session, covering 5 areas: the RAM as the scoring engine, factors as assessment inputs, scoring and rating configurations, how qualitative and quantitative scores work together, and roll-ups for aggregated visibility. Data model, key tables and attributes for those who want the technical details. Demo, will provide a walkthrough bringing it all together, key takeaways and resources, summary and references for your continued learning. With that, let's get started. All right, before we go further, let's talk about prerequisites. This session assumes foundational knowledge of ServiceNow IRM. We have identified 5 courses from the Speed Learning series to prepare you. First, risk taxonomy. This covers how risks are categorized and structured, the building blocks of any risk program. You will need to understand risk statements, risk hierarchy, and risk and controls, and how they all relate to one another. Second, risk assessment methodology 101. This is critical. The RAM is the engine behind everything we'll discuss today. If you're familiar with how methodologies are set up, today's content on risk scoring will be easier to follow. Third, advanced risk assessments. This course walks through how assessments are created, assigned, and completed within the Advanced Risk module. Fourth, risk assessment lifecycle. If you want to dig deeper on how assessments move through the lifecycle, this provides the end-to-end view. Fifth, and this one is optional, risk appetite. This is a great session to cover before or after risk scoring to understand how organizations identify the risk they are willing to accept and configure RAMs accordingly to arrive at risk appetite status when assessing and scoring risks. Find these in the community portal under Preparing for Your IRM Risk Management Adoption. If you haven't completed the pre-work, we encourage you to review them. If you have, you are well positioned for what's ahead. Now, let's cover the technical prerequisites. The core configurations that must be in place before risk scoring will function properly in your environment. two system properties, and two scheduled jobs that you must be aware before doing a deep dive into risk scoring. System properties. Migrate to advanced risk. Set to true to move from classic risk to advanced risk. This enables RAMs for assessments and scoring. Without it, you won't have access to these capabilities. Risk roll up for advanced risk assessments enables aggregation of scores across entity and risk hierarchies. Without it, you can score individual risks but won't get consolidated views. Scheduled jobs. GRC roll-up assessment scores runs only when both properties are true. Rolls up quantitative and qualitative scores across hierarchies. Defaults to every 5 minutes. GRC refresh risk scores. Well, this job is used by classic risk. This can remain inactive once you have migrated to advanced risk. Verify these configurations with your ARA administrator before building your risk scoring approach. Before we go deeper into risk scoring configurations, let's be clear about who configures risk scoring. The ARA risk admin is your power user role. This role must be explicitly granted. It provides elevated privileges across advanced risk. Risk admins configure frameworks, taxonomies, assessment methodologies, and continuous monitoring capabilities. They are the technical architects of your risk program. From a risk scoring perspective, they are responsible for defining manual, group, and automated factors, configuring scoring logic and rating criteria, setting assessment contributions, qualitative, quantitative, or both, establishing roll-up configurations, configuring heat maps, and setting up aggregation reports and risk appetite configurations. Well, the bottom line is to implement risk scoring, you will need this role, or you will need to partner with someone who has it. All right, let's set the foundation with a clear understanding of what risk scoring actually is. Introduction. At its core, risk scoring is simply the configurations plus the configurable logic embedded in risk assessment methodology, or RAM, that transforms factor responses of a risk assessment into meaningful outputs. When I say factor, think of it as a question posed during an assessment. Those responses get converted into two things: numeric values and ratings, more formally referred to as quantitative and qualitative scores in the risk domain. This happens across all assessment dimensions: inherent, control, residual, and target risk. And critically, these scores don't just sit at the individual risk level, they roll up across your risk hierarchies and entity hierarchies to give you aggregated views. If aggregated risk reports configurations of the advanced risk application are turned on or are in place. The concept. So, why do we score risks? Well, the purpose is straightforward. We take assessment responses about a risk and convert them into actionable scores. These scores allow organizations to prioritize risks, allocate resources where they matter most, and make informed risk decisions. Without scoring, you have opinions. With scoring, you have data. Okay, while we are here, one thing I would like to make clear upfront is scores are generically applicable to qualitative as well as quantitative evaluations in ServiceNow Advanced Risk. Again, scores are generically applicable to both quantitative as well as qualitative evaluations in ServiceNow Advanced Risk. That is, If it's a quantitative evaluation, scores are likely used as is, while when it comes to qualitative evaluation, scores are usually transformed to ratings such as high, medium, or low, for example. Let's look at some of the benefits. Some of the key benefits of advanced risk scoring are as follows. First, prioritization and effective resource utilization. Risk scoring lets you rank risks such as by impact and likelihood, so the critical ones surface to the top. This isn't just about risk visibility, it's about allocating your limited resources, call it time, people, or budget, whatever that matters to where they'll have the greatest effect. Second, data driven decisions. Clearer risk insights strengthen alignment to your risk appetite. When you have standardized criteria and calculations, you drive consistent risk decisions across the organization. You'll no longer compare apples to oranges. Third, workflow, automation, and productivity. Pre-established workflows and automation speed up the risk scoring process. Standardized questions and scores scale your assessments across hundreds or even thousands of risks without proportionally increasing the effort. Fourth, communication, consistency, and transparency. When everyone evaluates risks using shared scales and thresholds, you create a common language. Scores tied directly back to agreed upon ownership and escalation paths. There is no ambiguity about what a high risk means versus who is responsible for it. Fifth, compliance monitoring and performance. Scoring demonstrates to auditors that you have consistent, repeatable evaluations, not ad hoc judgments about risks. Tracking scores over time enables proactive risk management. You can see trends, um, catch emerging risks early, and demonstrate continuous improvement. Well, these benefits are why organizations invest in configuring risk scoring properly. It's the engine that makes your risk program actionable. All right, let's build our shared vocabulary. This is your glossary. Use it as a reference point throughout the session. Much of this is covered in the risk taxonomy session. Therefore, I will just briefly review the critical ones. The what of risk. Assessable entity. Anything you assess, such as application, process, business unit. Risk statement is reusable template in a library. Risk, it is that template that is applied to a specific accessible entity. So control objective is basically the goal. Control is the mechanism, such as firewall, approval process, etc. And control effectiveness is how well controls reduce risk, such as the impact or likelihood of risk that directly influences residual risk. Assessments. There are four types of assessments. Inherent assessment, risks without controls, control environment, collective control strength, individual controls, single control evaluation, residual, actual control exposure. Target is where you want to be. The risk scoring engine. Well, factors. Um, Factors are questions. They can be qualitative or quantitative. Weights dictate relative importance. Scores are numeric outputs, and ratings are labels like low, medium, or high. There are two scoring languages, qualitative. It's basically descriptive categories. Example, such as impact and likelihood could be low, medium, or high. Um, Quantitative numbers such as expressed as SLE, ALE, and ARO as factors. Automation. There are a few types of automation available out of the box. Query factors pull data from ServiceNow tables. Scripted factors use JavaScript for complex logic. Both keep scores current automatically. These are advanced topics. We won't focus on them in this session. The underlying the foundations of risk scoring applies to them consistently. The guardrail, well, risk appetite. How much risk you're willing to accept. Explore this in the risk appetite session. That's your toolkit. Please review closely for a deeper dive. Let's see how these pieces fit together for risk scoring. All right, now risk scoring, high level approach. Let's visualize how risk scoring flows end to end. This diagram shows the journey from assessment inputs to aggregated results. The inputs on the left-hand side. It starts with a risk assessment. An assessor opens an assessment and provides responses to factor questions. That's your primary input. But there is an optional layer, risk intelligence. This could be data from a loss scenario database, domain-specific intelligence for operational technology or cyber risks, or external feeds from partners. You will notice connectors like Safe IRM and Threat Connect risk quantifier available in the ServiceNow store. These can enrich your assessments with real-world threat data, usually through automated factors, but they are optional enhancements, not requirements. The engine in the center. All inputs feed into what I call the engine, the risk assessment methodology. This is where the magic happens. The RAM takes factor responses, applies your configurations in scoring logic, and produces output. It's the brain of your risk scoring, and you may have many RAMs that could power different risk assessments, all with an objective to convert the assessment responses into scores that keep you better informed about the risk at hand. The output or the outputs on the right hand side, as you can see, the engine produces a risk assessment score that ultimately derives quantitative or qualitative or both types of results at the factor and assessment level. That score then attaches to two things. One is the entity being assessed, and the other is the risk definition being evaluated. Last but not the least, the roll-ups. Here's where it gets powerful. Scores don't just sit at the individual level, they roll up across two dimensions. First, entity hierarchy, application to department to business unit to enterprise. This gives you aggregated risk posture by organizational structure. Second, the risk hierarchy. Child risks roll up to the parent risk statements and ultimately to enterprise risk categories. This gives you aggregated risk exposure by risk type. Together, these roll-ups enable executive dashboards that show true organizational risk posture, not just individual data points. The takeaway: inputs flow through the methodology engine, produce scores and ratings, and aggregate across both entity and risk hierarchies. That's the high-level approach. Now let's dig into the details. All right, we have seen the high-level flow, inputs, engine, outputs. Now let's look inside the engine itself. The risk assessment methodology has four configuration layers. Think of these four, think of these as the four questions you need to answer when building your scoring model. Roll-up strategy answers. How do scores aggregate upward? This is where you define how individual scores roll up to the entity and risk hierarchies for enterprise level views. Assessment approach answers: how are scores calculated? This determines whether you are using factors directly, deriving from other assessments, and whether contributions such as qualitative, quantitative, or both are applicable. Assessment types answers: what gets assessed? You enable the workflows you need: inherent, control, residual, target, based on your program requirements. And RAM core configuration answers: what are the building blocks? This is where factors, scoring logic, rating criteria, and heat maps come together. These four layers are like four questions, simple concept, but the configuration details matter. Let's drill into each layer and see exactly what you need to configure. All right, now let's open each layer and look at the specific configurations. Notice the arrow. We build from the bottom up. Start at the bottom. Factor configuration. Every score begins with a factor configuration. At this level, you configure how each factor contributes: qualitative, quantitative, or both. You assign weights to prioritize what matters most. You define scoring logic: simple direct mapping or calculated using formulas like minimum, maximum, average, sum, product, weighted average, or custom script. And optionally, you set transformation criteria to standardize values. Get your factors right, everything else depends on them. Middle layer, assessment configuration. Next, you configure each assessment type: inherent, control, residual, target. Here, you link the factors you just configured, define how they combine into an overall assessment score, calculated using formulas like minimum, maximum, average, sum, product, weighted average, or custom script. You set up rating criteria to convert scores to labels like low, medium, high, and configure heat maps for visualization. This is where factor level inputs become assessment level outputs. And then the top layer, roll-up configuration. Finally, you define aggregation. Which assessment types participate in roll-up? What formulas apply? Sum, average, maximum, minimum for both ALE and scores? What business rules and validations govern the process? This layer transforms individual assessments into enterprise risk posture. The takeaway: well, bottom up, factors feed assessments, assessment feed roll-ups. The previous slide showed the four layer conceptually. This slide shows you exactly what to configure in each. Get a good handle of this structure and you are on the right track. All right. Factors are the foundation of risk scoring. They are the questions that capture the data you need to calculate risk. Let's break down the three types and how they connect to scoring. Manual factors. These are your human-centered questions. An assessor sees the question, selects or enters a response. Manual factors support multiple response types: percentage, number, choice, currency, and text. Note that text responses don't contribute to score calculations. They are for context only. Manual factors can contribute qualitatively to produce numeric score results or quantitatively for ALE calculations. Same factor, different contribution paths depending on how your RAM is configured. Group factors. Think of group factors as containers. A group factor's score depends on the responses of its child manual factors. For example, you might have a control environment group factor that aggregates 5 individual control questions. Like manual factors, groups can contribute qualitatively or quantitatively, or the power is in how you aggregate them. The system offers predefined formulas like average, sum, maximum, minimum, and product. Need something custom? Well, you can write a script. Automated factors. This is where continuous risk monitoring comes alive. Automated factors pull data without human intervention, giving you real-time risk posture. There are two flavors out of the box. Query-based factors let you select a table or view, define criteria, and specify how values translate to scores. Script-based factors give you full flexibility, write custom JavaScript to compute risk results from any data source. On the right side, we see how factors feed scoring. Looking at the diagram on the right, factors are determined by control type, carry weights for relative importance, can be quantitative or qualitative in contribution, ultimately produce scores, ratings, and ALE values, and get transformed through your rating criteria. The takeaway here is manual factors are for human judgment, group for aggregating related questions, automated for real-time data. All three feed the same scoring engine. Choose the right type of factor for the right use case. All right. This diagram shows, so we are at the risk assessment score and rating in ALE. Well, this diagram shows how scores flow from individual assessment types up to the overall risk assessment. Let's walk through each path. The destination here is the risk assessment. At the top, you see the risk assessment. This is the combined output. It produces both qualitative and quantitative results, score slash rating, and ALE. Every path below feeds into this. Of course, this assumes you have activated every workflow, inherent control effectiveness, residual, and target. Inherent assessment on the left side. Inherent is straightforward. You assess impact and likelihood using factors. Those factor responses combine to produce qualitative and quantitative outputs. Classic risk equation is impact times likelihood is equal to inherent risk. Control assessment, the second column. Controls offer two approaches. Control environment assessment evaluates controls collectively using factors, and individual controls assessment evaluates each control separately, also using factors. Pick the approach that matches your control maturity. Either way, factors drive the score. Residual assessment, third column. Here's where it gets interesting. Residual can be calculated in two ways. Option number one, impact times likelihood using factors. Either reuse the same factors as inherent or configure specific residual factors. This gives assessors the chance to reassess after considering controls. Option number two, inherent times control. The system drives residual from your inherent score and control effectiveness. No additional factor responses needed. Choose based on your program needs. Derived is faster. Factor-based gives more granularity. Target assessment. on the right-hand side. Target follows a similar pattern. Use impact times likelihood with factors, same as inherent or same as residual, or specify target factors. Or calculate from overall assessment scores derived from inherent or residual, respectively. Target represents your goal state. So factor-based input often makes sense here for deliberate target setting. The takeaway: 4 assessment types, multiple calculation paths, one unified output. The flexibility is intentional. Configure what fits your risk program. Factors are the common thread, but derived calculations can simplify where appropriate. All right, we have talked about risk scoring individual assessments. Now, let's see how those scores aggregate to give leadership the visibility they need. Risk scores are rating and yearly roll up across 2 dimensions: entity hierarchy, risk, risk statement hierarchy, or both. Let's trace each path. On the left-hand side, roll up by entity. Assessments produce scores at the bottom. These scores aggregate to the entity level, your application, process, or business unit. Then they roll up further to parent entity, department, division, enterprise. This allows entity owners to track their risk posture. A department head sees aggregated risk across all applications in their portfolio, and executive sees aggregated risk across all departments. On the right-hand side, roll up by risk statement. Same assessments at the bottom, but notice they are attached to risk instances. Those risks aggregate to their risk statement. The parent risk definition. Risk statements then roll up to the parent risk statement across that is your enterprise risk categories. This roll up rolls up inherent risk scores slash rating and ALE, control effectiveness, residual risk scores slash rating and ALE, and optionally target risk. The risk function gets a complete view of enterprise risk posture by risk type, not just organizational unit. Well, the intersection. Here's the power. These 2 dimensions can work together. You can see what's the total cyber risk across the company, that is by risk statement hierarchy, or what's the total risk exposure in the retail banking division, that is by the entity hierarchy, but same underlying data and different aggregation views are possible. There is a third option using the desired risk reports, or what we also call as custom reporting dimensions. The third option of custom reporting dimensions using managed aggregated risks report feature, you can define specific slices. Want to monitor internal fraud risk specifically for retail banking? It is possible using custom reporting dimensions. You can define that dimension and track it independently. We'll see that during the demo. The takeaway here is roll-ups transform individual assessments into strategic intelligence. Entity roll-up serves business owners, whereas risk statement roll-up serves the risk function. Custom reports serve specific targeted risk stakeholders. And you can configure all three for complete visibility. For those who want to understand what's happening under the hood, we have this data model that powers risk scoring at the runtime. Let's review the risk scoring runtime data model and let's trace the relationships. Starting at the bottom, assessment responses. At the foundation, we have risk assessment instance response. This stores individual factor responses. Every answer an assessor provides lands here. One assessment has many responses. That's one-to-many relationship you'll see. The assessment record. The responses roll up to the risk assessment. This is your assessment record. It links one to one with an entity on the left and one to one with the risk on the right. Every assessment is anchored to both what you're assessing, the entity, and what risk you're evaluating. On the left-hand side, the entity hierarchy. The entity connects to its upstream entity in a one-to-many relationship. One parent entity has many children entities. This is your organizational hierarchy. Application, for example, rolls up to the department, department rolls up to division, and so on. On the right-hand side, risk hierarchy. The risk connects to a risk statement. That risk statement can have a parent risk statement, creating your risk taxonomy. Child risks roll up to parent risk categories. Notice also the many-to-many relationship between risk and control. Multiple controls can mitigate multiple risks. The center, the roll-up results, is where aggregated scores live. This is your detailed aggregated risk record. It connects one to one with the risk assessment methodology at the top, one to one with the entity on the left, and one to one with the risk statement on the right. The aggregated risk reports, report definition, way up top ties everything together neatly into consolidated report, which fuels the risk summaries for assessments, entity hierarchy, and risk hierarchy. Why this matters? When you run reports, build dashboards, or query aggregated risk posture, this is where the data comes from. Understanding this model helps you troubleshoot, build custom reports, and extend the platform when needed. The key takeaway here is responses feed assessments, assessments link to entities and risks, roll up results aggregate across both hierarchies, the RAM governs it all, and that's the runtime data model enabling everything as far as risk scoring is concerned. So we are going to be reviewing the key tables and attributes now. First, the first table, this is where factor responses live. This is part of the top layer, the assessment instance. Every response links back to its parent assessment instance and identifies which assessment type it belongs to: inherent, control, residual, or target. The table risk assessment instance response stores every individual response to every factor in an assessment. If your assessment has 10 factors, you'll have 10 records in this table for that assessment. In case of group factor, the evaluation results are stored. So let's look at the core attributes by context. In the second layer, what we see is the factor response. This tells you what question was asked. Factor captures what was asked. The factor field references the factor definition. Transformation criteria indicates if any value transformation was applied to convert the raw response into a score ready value. And factor response is the meat of the record. What did the assessor actually answer? You have factor response for raw input, then qualitative response and quantitative response for the converted values based on contribution type. Parent responses link grouped factor responses to their parent. Prior response stores the previous assessment's answer, useful for comparison, and the copy prior response feature. At the bottom layer, we have the control. This only applies to individual control assessments. Control weighting captures the relative importance of this control in the overall control effectiveness calculation. Why this matters? This is your audit trail for assessment inputs. When someone asks, why did we get this score? You can trace it back through these response records to see exactly what was answered, how it was transformed, and how it contributed to the calculation. As a pro tip, the prior response field is powerful for trend analysis. Compare current responses to prior responses to see how risk perception is changing over time. There are a few more tables to go through. All right, let me walk you through the anatomy of a risk record. We'll start at the center, the core. Every assessment anchors to three things: the risk being evaluated, the entity being assessed, and the RAM driving the calculations. This is your foundation. Radiating outward, four assessment types: inherent, control effectiveness, residual, and target. Each captures a different lens of the same risk. Each generates scores slash ratings and or ALE. Not every assessment uses all four. It depends on your RAM configuration. Now, here's the key insight. For each assessment type, you get the same five attribute categories. Assessment stores your final values, what feeds reporting, and roll-ups. Computation stores what the system calculated based on your RAM logic. Overridden captures manual adjustments when assessors intervene. Booleans are your flags, such as override indicators, applicability settings, and so on. Comments provide the justification trail. The flow is simple. System computes, assessors can override, final values feed rollups, same pattern four times over across inherent, control effectiveness, residual, and target. Once you understand one assessment type, you understand them all. Now let's get into the technical reference. This is the second slide covering the key table and attributes. Now keep this as a reference material. You don't need to memorize all of this, but you'll definitely want to know where to look. Again, the table here is risk assessment instance. We are looking at this table, which is abbreviated, the records of which are abbreviated as RASMT. This table stores every risk assessment in the system as it pertains to advanced risk assessments. The core attributes at the top, the core assessment fields link the assessment to its risk assessable entity and the risk assessment methodology. These three references anchor every assessment. Assessment fields store the final values, the risk rating, ALE, and final score that get used for reporting and roll-up. Computation field stores calculated values, where what the system computed based on your RAM configuration before any manual adjustments. Overridden fields capture manual overrides. When an assessor changes the computed value, both the override and the originals are preserved. This is critical for audit trails. Boolean fields are flags like override computed inherent score to indicate an override occurred or residual risk not applicable for exception handling. Comments fields capture SSA justifications, specifically important when overrides occur. Why all of this matters? Because when you are troubleshooting why a score looks unexpected, this is where you will investigate. Is it a computational issue or an override? The separation of computed versus assessment fields tells the story. Pro tip, the final score fields, such as the final inherent score, final control score, final residual score, final target score, these are what feed into roll-up calculations. Everything else is supporting detail. All right, two more tables to complete. Let's move on. Now, let's look at where aggregate scores land. The roll-up result. This is the third table. This is where aggregated results live. If you're building executive dashboards, this is your source of truth. Again, the table roll-up result at the top, that is the core. Every roll-up result anchors to an accessible entity, risk statement, contributing risk assessments that feed the aggregation, and a roll-up status indicating if it's current. This record stores aggregated scores and ratings after roll-up calculations run. Point to be noted is the results are tracked against a risk assessment methodology. Advanced roll-up result attributes. The aggregation categories. Two columns that matter here are qualitative and quantitative. Um, on, on the left-hand side, this includes so qualitative, this includes ratings for inherent control effectiveness, residual, and target. And below that, scores with 5 aggregation options: base, average, uh, minimum, maximum, and sum. On the right hand side, quantitative, this is your financial exposure, ALEs. Same 5 aggregation options: base, average, minimum, maximum, and sum for inherent, residual, and target. This is where it gets comprehensive. Notice the pattern. For every assessment type, inherent, control, residual, target, you get multiple aggregation views. Ratings give you the qualitative labels: inherent rating, control effectiveness, residual rating, target rating, whereas scores give you the primary numeric values for each assessment type. Average scores calculate the mean across contributing assessments, useful when you want a balanced view. Minimum scores show the lowest of values, useful for identifying your best performing areas. Maximum scores show the highest values, critical for identifying your worst case exposure. And sum of scores that totals everything up is useful for understanding cumulative exposure. The same pattern repeats for ALE. You'll see the identical structure for annual loss expectancy, base ALEs, then average, minimum, maximum, and some variance. This gives you complete flexibility in how you report quantitative risk. Finally, report definition. links to any custom aggregated risk reports configured for this rollup. Why this matters? This table powers your executive dashboards, your board reports, your risk appetite comparisons. When leadership asks what our total cyber risk exposure is, the answer ideally comes from here. This is where individual assessments become enterprise risk intelligence. A few more tables to complete the picture. All right, final table slide. These three tables complete the overall picture. They are the anchors that tie assessments and roll-ups to your organizational and risk structures. Table 1, risk. This is your risk instance table, a specific risk applied to a specific assessable entity. In the core context, the risk field contains the risk details, the entity links to what's being assessed. In the ARA context, you will find risk assessment methodology, um, primary, the RAM designated as primary for this risk, and the risk instance linking to the actual assessment record. Table 2 is risk statement. This is your risk library, the reusable risk templates. Core context includes entity for any direct entity associations and risk roll-up status indicating whether roll-up data is current. ARA roll-up result context shows methodology for status calculation. Primary, which RAM drives risk assessment aggregated status, and the advanced roll-up result linking to the aggregated scores. Risk statements are where your risk hierarchy lives. Child statements roll up to the parent risk statements, ultimately reaching enterprise risk categories. Table 3, entity. This is your organizational structure. Applications, processes, departments, business units. Core context includes applies to for the underlying record reference. Risk assessment methodology, primary for the designated RAM, and risk roll-up status. ARA roll-up results links to the advanced roll-up result containing aggregated entity level scores. Well, the connection. These three tables, risk statement, and entity, are where roll-up results land. The previous slides showed how data flows. These tables show where the aggregated results appear for reporting and decision making. The key takeaways, 4 slides, 4 key table groups, assessment instance for individual assessments, instance responses for factor answers, roll-up results for aggregation, and risk statement entity for organizational anchors or enterprise risk views. Bookmark these for reference when building reports or troubleshooting. That completes our in-depth data model walkthrough. Now let's move on to the demo. All right, let's bring everything together with a live demonstration. The use case. We'll walk through risk scoring using a real-world scenario, the online banking portal. This is a customer-facing digital channel that enables banking transactions online. It's a critical asset for the organization, making it an ideal candidate for risk assessment. This portal serves as our primary entity where risk assessments are conducted. 2 risks are evaluated for this portal. 1. Remote maintenance of online banking portal assets is performed without approval. This addresses the operational risk of unauthorized changes being made to portal infrastructure, which could introduce vulnerabilities or service disruptions. Number 2, unavailability of online banking portal due to technology failure or cyber attack. This covers the risk of the portal going down, whether due to system failures or malicious attacks, directly impacting customer access and business continuity. These risk assessments are powered by the operational risk RAM, which defines our factors, scoring logic, and roll-up configurations. The RAM determines how we evaluate inherent risk, control effectiveness, residual risk, and target risk, and ultimately how those scores aggregate up through our hierarchies for enterprise level visibility. Also, to call out quickly, the entity hierarchy of our online banking portal sits within a four-level organizational structure. The online banking portal rolls into retail online banking, customer banking, and alpha banking. Scores will roll through each level, giving progressively broader views of risk exposure. The risk hierarchy, both the risks roll into channel availability risk, which then rolls into technology and cyber risk. This gives us aggregated views by risk category, not just by organizational unit. What we'll cover in this demo is I'll walk through the example use case setup, including the entity hierarchy, risk statements hierarchy, risks and control registers, and assessment scope. Then we'll step through risk assessments, review the assessment results, and see how scores roll up. Finally, we'll look at the aggregated risk reports that bring it all together. What we won't cover, we are keeping the focus on core risk scoring concepts only. Scripted and query factors aren't explicitly covered, but remember the scoring approach remains consistent whether factors are manual or automated. It doesn't matter. We'll also skip reports, dashboards, heat maps, and risk appetite for today. Those are great topics for follow-up sessions. Let's dive in. All right. The role required for what we are about to review is risk administrator. We are going to begin with reviewing the hierarchies. So the first thing that we're going to be reviewing is the entity hierarchy. So let's navigate to GRC Workbench and launch the workbench. As we launch the workbench, we can navigate to model setup, dependency map, and then we can search for the organization Alpha Bank. So we'll navigate to organization and look for Alpha Bank. We could drill down into Alpha Bank and see the hierarchy of entities. So as we just noted, online banking portal rolls into retail online banking, which then rolls into customer banking, which rolls into Alpha Bank. That's our entity hierarchy. We will be conducting our risk assessments primarily on online banking portal. And then we'll see how these risk assessments results roll up the hierarchy. Next, let's also review the risk hierarchy while we are here, for which we navigate to risk dependencies, risk statement hierarchy. Let's search for technology and cyber risk and drill down through the hierarchy. So we'll search for technology and cyber risk, and there it is. And we can drill down through the hierarchy, and let's say we can investigate channel availability risk. So over here, we see the hierarchy that we have set up. This is for the risk statements. We have our risk remote maintenance of online banking portal and unavailability of online banking portal due to technology failure. These two roll into channel availability risk, which then rolls into technology and cyber risk. There you go. That's our risk hierarchy. Now let's review the risk and control register of which we will be performing the assessments. So let's go ahead and go back over here. We can navigate to the workspaces. So it's going to be workspace, risk workspace, the list view, library. And while we are at library, we can review risks. And let's search for entity starts with online. So we have these two risk records created. They have been instantiated from the risk statements. And notice the entity is online banking portal and the owner is Vinsettle. All right, let's also review the control registers while we are here. Again, let's search for the entity starts with online. There you go. These are our 4 controls that we will also be using during assessing during the risk assessments. So that's basically our setup of risk and control registers. Now let's navigate to the workspace risk assessment scope, which is part of the risk assessment planning. Now, this is the risk assessment scope, which is part of the risk assessment planning, is what is really used for instantiating your risk assessments, or really scoping and then instantiating the risk assessments. So let's look up with online banking portal. Notice that the risk assessment methodology is operational risk. All right. So as we review the risk assessment scope, we have scoped this for the business application online banking portal. The owner is Vinsettle. We have mapped the risks from the risk register, assigned these to the entity owner for taking the assessments, and then instantiated these assessments so that Vinsettle can take can take these risk assessments. All right, moving on. So building on this, we are going to be reviewing one of the risk assessments, which is the remote maintenance of online banking portal. So let's review this assessment. It has been already taken by Vinsettle. As you can see, the status is completed. We will go ahead and review the assessment, and there you go. So let's quickly review the inherent assessment, more so from a scoring perspective, will be our focus. So as we look at the inherent assessment, it consists of impact, factors, and likelihood, and that generates your scoring as a product. That's the default configuration. So as we look at these factors, they are going to be either having a qualitative score or a quantitative score. So this has a qualitative score of 3. This has a qualitative score of 4. And the others have quantitative scores. So let's focus on qualitative. So in this case, we see that the qualitative score is 4 because the RAM has been configured to pick up the max value of the qualitative scores of the factors. And hence this is 4, very high. And basically the criteria has converted that score into very high. The next is the quantitative score of 3 and that of 3000 for these factors respectively. We see that the quantitative score here is 9000. That implies that this must be a product. Now, as far as the likelihood is concerned, likewise, based on how the RAM has been configured, we are arriving at the qualitative score of 3 and the quantitative score of 0.9. So we will dwell into how the score itself has been computed. So if you look at the score here is 4. Now, the way it has been configured in the RAM is that it is a maximum of the qualitative scores of impact and likelihood. So the score is 4. But notice that it has been mapped from a criteria perspective, from a transformation perspective, it has been mapped to 5 critical, which is fine. That's the mapping that has been defined in the RAM. Now let's look at the ALE. The ALE is appearing to be an average of the quantitative scores of 9,000 and 0.90. So that comes to $4,500.45. That's the average. In a similar way, the control assessments, this appears to be the mitigating controls have been selected and they each have been assessed. So this appears to be an individual control assessment rather than environment assessment. So for these individual controls, let's review the very first one. So this one appears to be a qualitative score of 2, 3, and 4. And this is an average. So we see the qualitative score of 3 is an average of 2, 3, and 4. Whereas these two are quantitative scores. So 3 and 0.20. And it appears that this is a product. So there you go, the quantitative score is 0.6. Likewise, for the other control, the qualitative score and the quantitative score has been derived using the same formulas. Whereas the scoring control effectiveness has been derived as the average for qualitative. So it's basically 3 plus 2 divided by 2. So that's 2.5. And that has been mapped to 2 mostly effective from the risk criteria. Notice that the quantitative results are not displayed. They're not applicable for control assessments, generally speaking. You wouldn't necessarily say, what is the cost of performing control assessments. It's part of the business. We have to perform those assessments as part of managing the risks. So even though out of the box, there is capability for you to capture quantitative inputs, it's more informational. From a risk scoring perspective, it doesn't matter. At least from a RAM configuration perspective, it doesn't out of the box. Moving forward from a residual assessment perspective, it's very similar to how we completed the risk assessment, inherent assessments, and in that way, it's very much similar. So we will skip reviewing this in detail, but know that the residual assessment is also impact and likelihood, and so is the target assessment. And based on the RAM configurations for these assessments, these scores have been computed accordingly. So with that, we are ready to move forward. So this is one of the risks that we have reviewed. Likewise, the other risk has also been assessed by Winsettle, and similarly, scores have been generated. So now let's review this further from a deeper dive perspective. Now, what really has happened behind the scenes? All right, as we review what has happened behind the scenes, let's quickly recall this runtime data model. So we have these critical tables that we're going to be specifically focusing on in the next couple of minutes. Risk assessment instance response, risk assessment, and roll-up result. The other tables really are just related to the risk assessment, such as the risk registers and controls, as we just reviewed the assessments, and of course, the tie back to the entities and risk statements, respectively. From a risk assessment methodology perspective, we are in our example using operational risk. And last but not least, we will also zoom in to the aggregated risk reports, reviewing the risk report definitions. So with that, let's get going. All right. So for the next couple of minutes, I will be playing the role of a system administrator, which is an even more higher elevated role compared to the risk administrator, because we will be accessing behind the scene data, which is stored in the tables. And of course, what you see here in the assessments is what a risk manager or the application owners would probably be interested in or accessing this information around assessments. But then we want to investigate how this runtime data model helps drive the risk scoring. So that's where we are now impersonating a system administrator. So with that, let's search for system definition. And we're going to look up tables. And one of the first tables that we want to investigate is the risk assessment instance response. So let's go ahead and type in the name. This is the table we want to review for the responses that have been stored from the assessment is in this table. So once we navigate to this table in system definition, let's click on show list action. It basically shows the data that's residing in this table. So what we are really interested in, we'll go ahead and keep the risk workspace open in a separate tab. And navigate back to where we were just to grab the risk assessment. All right, so we'll be investigating this assessment. This assessment has been responded by Winsettle, and we want to review the responses of this assessment. So let's get back over here. So once we are at the assessment, risk assessment instance response table, we will go ahead and import the instance. So there you go. We can see now the assessment instance data. What we see in the workspace as we navigate to this and view behind the scenes, this is how the system stores it. So we're going to do a group by assessment type, just reviewing this very specific assessment. And as we do the group by, we can see these are the four assessment types: inherent, control, residual, and target. So as we do that, let's do a further group by so that we can do, very specific. We can zoom into inherent assessment, let us say, and we can do a further group by. Before we do that, real quick, so what we see here is this is the assessment type, this is the factor, this is the display order. Here is the transformation criteria that has resulted in the values for impact and likelihood, as we can see. Here are the factor responses for those factors that have been responded. Here is the qualitative response, and here is the quantitative response, if there is any, right? If there was a control that's associated, which we will see in the control assessment, you could see information flowing in here under control and control weightage. If there was any prior response, if this assessment was taken twice, then you would have the prior response society over here. So now with this, let's do a group by parent response. Now what this really does is the parent here basically means impact and likelihood, because those are your group factors. So if you do group by parent response, for impact, these are the factors. And we see, again, these are the responses, qualitative and quantitative, which is what we reviewed in the workspace. And these are for the likelihood. And when we review the impact factor, which is the group factor, based on how this has been responded, it has resulted in qualitative response value and quantitative response value for impact. So in this case, it's a maximum for qualitative. So we see 4 here. So 3 and 4, we see 4 here. And as far as quantitative is concerned, this is a product of 3 and 3000. So you see 9000 over here. The transformation criteria has mapped the qualitative response to very high. So that is what we have seen. So with that, let's quickly review the other assessment, which is control assessment. So as we review the control assessment, all I've done is I've changed the filters over here and I've selected the assessment type as control assessment and reran this. And the same concept applies. So for every single control record, you have this grouping. So this prior response over here represents a control record. So for every single control record, you have these factors that have been answered. So rest everything kind of like remains more or less the same. The qualitative response and the quantitative response values are derived. And you can see that the control is populated over here. Because this is the control which has been specifically evaluated. You can even do a group by control just to have a more clearer visibility into it. But then group by parent response helps us see it from the perspective, from the lens of, now when these controls are evaluated, how does this result in the control effectiveness value? So we see the qualitative and the quantitative values derived from these responses below, and the transformation criteria results in partially effective. So with that, let's continue moving. Okay, so this is 251. All right, so we are reviewing 251. So there you go. This is for the first control, the qualitative score is partially effective. And for the second control, it's mostly effective. And then of course, like based on how the RAM has been configured, this has resulted in an average, and that is mostly effective. So yeah, let's go back and review the data structure. Okay. So what we will see is the final scorings are going to be on the risk assessment instance. These are just the responses, what we're reviewing. We'll get back to the instance in a short bit. Well, the same approach is applicable to the residual assessment and target assessment as well. So we're gonna skip that. Basically, this table is really talking about the assessment responses. Now let's talk about the assessment instance response. So let me just pull up the table. All right, so we navigate back to system definition and tables. And just a quick word before we move forward. So what we just reviewed with the instance risk assessment instance response, these columns may be hidden. So you may have to just personalize these and add it to your list view so that you can see all of these columns. The same goes with the table risk assessment instance response. Let's open this. And again, we're going to go to show list. And as we do that, I have personalized these columns. They are basically available, but they are not necessarily visible on the screen. So I had personalized and added these columns. So over here, what we really want to focus on a couple of things. We'll start with inherent risk. So again, we will have to focus on the assessment that we have been reviewing. So here is the assessment, instance assessment number. So let's copy and paste that. So there you go. This is the one that we have been reviewing so far from an instance response perspective. And this is the instance record. So again, one instance has many responses. So this is for the online banking portal for the risk remote maintenance of online banking portal. The maintenance is performed without approval. So over here, we have these attributes that we are interested in. It's basically these scores, what we have seen: inherent risk, inherent ALE, when it comes to control assessment, control effectiveness. Then when it comes to residual risk, and residual ALE, and likewise target risk and target ALE. So this is where you have those values stored. So inherent risk. So as we noted, the score was 4, and the transformation criteria has mapped it to 5 critical. That's based on how the RAM was configured. But notice how the inherent rating is 5, score 5, and 5 critical. That's because how the transformation criteria, we'll review this more closely when we get to the RAM. It's basically how the RAM is set up, right? So in this case, this is the score that we have arrived at. But then when it comes to rating is more of like the qualitative perspective of the same score. Well, this as well is the qualitative perspective, but this is the true score. Now, how the RAM has been configured is that has been mapped back to score 5 because it is 5 critical, and that's, I think, once we get to the RAM, we will see that more clearly. But keep this in mind. We will get back to this. This is more of rating again, and this is more of score. All right, so this is score. And as we move forward, we'll see the ALE value. So this is what we had seen here as well when it comes to the inherent ALE. That's stored here in this attribute. You have the final inherent score, which is 4, basically what we saw over here. And then you have the computed inherent rating, which is 5. Yeah, so net, this score 5 is more like the computed value, whereas this is what we have received from the assessment. So the system has computed this to be or kind of like upgraded this to this particular score based on how the RAM was set up, which also maps to 5 critical, by the way. So it's how this weirdly this particular RAM is set up. So notice there are some other attributes. Computed attributes basically is the same values that you would see here are also present in the computer attributes, because that's really what the system has computed. So it just keeps a reference point. Now, why that is important is if somebody overrides those values manually, then the system has a reference point of what was originally computed. So it keeps in the computed attribute. Whereas the inherent risk when overridden, if it was overridden, you would have the overridden value over here. And what is inherent risk when overridden? What is the inherent ALE? There are a couple of attributes which look very similar, but if you had the overridden performed, you would see some minor differences, or in some cases the values may just be the same, like inherent risk when overridden, inherent risk when overridden. This appears to be more of a score. This is more of a rating. I believe this is also a rating. That's why both of these are appearing as empty, because they're kind of like pointing to nothing. That's the ALE. That's the inherent ALE when overridden, inherent score when overridden, computed, overridden, override computed inherent score, comments for inherent risk. Then we get into control effectiveness, which is what we see here. So the score is 2.5, which is mapped to mostly effective based on how the RAM is configured. So we see this is the control effectiveness value. And again, see the minor delta difference of how this kind of like ends up as a rating, similar to how we saw it for the inherent risk rating versus inherent risk. This is also sort of like mapped or really computed back to score 2, which again is also 2 most effective. So just a minor difference in how the RAMs are configured. This gives you the true North Star and like the what really is the score versus a subtle dumbed down version of the control effectiveness rating. So this is a different lens, rating lens versus the score lens. This is the final control score. Computed control effectiveness, score versus rating, and then computed control score. Again, the system just keeps like a backup copy. And then when these are overridden, then you have a bunch of overridden values. We will move past those. No mitigating controls to assess. That's false because we are assessing mitigating controls. Comments for control effectiveness, if there was any. Then we land into residual risk, which is here in this case, score is 1 to moderate. This is what your residual risk is. Again, look at how the residual rating is slightly, bumped up from a score perspective, but then the qualitative value is still the same. It's just basically how the RAM is configured. The next is residual ALE, final residual score, which is what we saw as 1. Again, computed residual score, computed residual rating, so which is what we basically saw here. This is 1 and this is computed value is 2. It kind of like matches over here as well. And then computed residual ALE, computed residual score. Then if these were overridden, then the overridden values, and so on and so forth for target as well. So I think we get the point. So I'm gonna leave target, and towards the end, you will see some Boolean values like is target assessment applicable? Yep, that is true. Is it mandatory? Yes, it is. Is previous assessment risk response selected? If there was, then this would be true. But in this case, it isn't. So it is false. So with that, let's move forward and review our next table. Actually, before we review our next table, let's touch upon the RAM briefly. Since I'm a system administrator, I do see risk assessment methodologies of just. I'll just click on this, launch it in a new window, and that's my RAM. Okay. So we'll traverse this top down real quick. What we have here is the roll-up configurations. That's where we specified that calculate ALE based on average and calculate score based on maximum. Okay. So in this case, ALE is calculated as average, but average of what? Average of quantitative scores determined from, so quantitative scores that are determined. Again, it is as ALE, so it is an average of quantitative scores from inherent assessment, control, residual, and target assessments. And this score, which is it's basically your qualitative portion of it, which is scores are used for generating the qualitative values, by the way, right? So it's the scores that gives you the ratings, right? So the scores are the is going to take the maximum in this case from inherent, control, residual, and target. Now that's for the roll-up configurations. So we need to remember that. Now let's take inherent assessment real quick. Notice that the assessment contribution is both, so it's basically qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative score is maximum as part of the scoring logic. This is maximum. Maximum of what? Maximum of the factors, impact and likelihood. And impact and likelihood are derived from other factors because this is a group factor. And quantitative score is average of these factors. Of course, the quantitative values. Now let's take a dig into inherent assessment now. This is what we just noted in the list configuration. The qualitative score and the quantitative score, and these below factors, are the group factors. So over here, the group factors are, you can notice that the factor contributes the risk to the risk score. Either so it contributes both ways, right? So qualitatively and quantitatively. And the weight of this factor is 100%. And there is a transformation criteria, which is what is driving or deriving the qualitative rating for the qualitative score. So a lot of this is covered in the other speed learnings that we have mentioned in the prerequisites. So we'll not go too deeper dive over here, but these are our configurations which ultimately are driving the risk scores. So very briefly, we just wanted to go back to this. Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to ensure that we touched upon is, once the qualitative score and the quantitative scores are available, the qualitative rating applies to qualitative scores. Notice the lower limit of the range. So we come over here, notice the lower limit of the range and the score values. Notice the actual score, okay, in case of quantitative. So let's go back over here. Okay, so let's take a check on this. Okay, as far as the quantitative scores are concerned, they are just going to be directly mapped and stored. Like, those are just quantitative values. It's the qualitative that requires the transformation criteria to be applied, and hence the qualitative transformation criteria. But what I really wanted to stress upon is, for each of these factors, this transformation criteria, if it's a qualitative value, it applies, and we can notice that the lower limit in this case is same as that of the score. Therefore, this is what results in the score, which we saw earlier. But then when we navigate back to impact and likelihood, the ultimate qualitative rating is derived um, based on these two factors. And that is where, we noticed in our responses, even in the workspace, and as we investigated the responses, there was a slight difference in the inherent risk versus the rating. That's because of how these lower intervals are configured versus the overridden score. So notice how 0 is mapped to 1, but it's the rating is 1 low. 1 is mapped to 2, but the rating is 2 moderate. Therefore, we noticed that slight difference, that subtle difference in the inherent risk versus the rating. That's because of the RAM configuration. Let's take a quick, we'll breeze through this, the control assessments. This is basically the control effectiveness factor. And based on the factor responses, the qualitative ratings are applied. And again, looking at how this has been configured from a RAM perspective, as you can see, it's only the qualitative scoring logic that matters when it comes to the control effectiveness values. Now, with that, we can move forward, and we're gonna give a pass at the residual and target assessments, because those are very much similar to that of inherent in how those are set up, at least from a RAM perspective. Now let's continue with we're digging in some of the other critical tables. Now, this time we're going to be focusing on something called as roll up result. That's where the roll ups are stored. So we'll be investigating that now. All right, let's navigate back over here again, system definition, tables, and let's key in roll up result. So we can pull that table up and again look at the list. I have personalized these columns and added them to this view. The next thing that we want to do is, let's first search with operational risk, and we can focus now. As you can see, there are 24 records over here, but we will have our way to traverse through this so that we can understand this. So let me first apply some of the filters, and then we will peel it like different layers of an onion. Yeah, I was referring to the veggie. So let's apply some of these filters. So the filter that I want to add to risk methodology, operational risk, and we'll say accessible entity is empty, or risk statement is empty. So we run this and now we end up with 8 records. I'm going to filter this further for the time being, and I'm going to remove a few other records over here. So such as, we'll start with customer banking, retail online banking, Alpha Bank. So we filtered those out. No, those are your basically entities. So we have filtered out the entities, those are from the hierarchy. And then we're going to be also doing the same thing for risk statement. So we're going to filter out channel availability risk and technology and cyber risk. Now, from this point forward, we will be investigating this broadly to understand 4 major activities that drive roll-up calculations. Again, there are 4 major activities that drive the roll-up calculations, and we will take it slowly, one by one. So let's talk about one. So number one, exactly based on, so the activity number one, as I refer to this, the activity number one is, it's exactly based on the risk assessment. Couple of entries are dropped in detailed aggregated risk table. This is this table. One for one assessed entity and risk statement respectively. So there's one for one entry being made in over here for the assessed entity and risk statement respectively. And as we recall from our assessments, we can go back over here briefly. We can probably close this. Going back to the scope, our entity is basically online banking portal, and we had initiated 2 assessments. One for remote maintenance versus the other for the unavailability. And if you go back, that's what we are focused on. This one for one risk statement and one for the assessed entity. So you will see an entry being made over here. So that's point number one. Now, regardless of number of risk assessments, which we can view by clicking on contributing risk assessments. These entries calculate the risk rollups, effectively generating rollups at targeted assessed entity and risk statement. So it doesn't matter how many risk assessments. In this context, for those risk statement, we can see all the contributing risk assessments. For this assessed entity, we can see all the contributing risk assessments, and they're all going to be captured in this fashion. So let's start with remote maintenance of online banking portal. So as we click on view, we see there's one risk assessment that we took for this, that is contributing risk assessment to this particular entry that is storing the roll-up risk scores, ratings, and ALE. Okay. Likewise for unavailability as well, that's just one risk assessment. And it's not a surprise that for online banking portal, there should be 2, because we took 2 assessments, one for each risk for online banking portal. All right, so yes, we will do a deeper dive into everything over here, but let's just complete the 4 major activities. So we just completed number 1 is what's bare minimum captured in terms of the assessment, risk assessment entries. Now let's talk about number 2. So we'll be reviewing these scores in a little bit, but we needed to understand how these are captured as the risk assessments are taken and what kind of entries are being made in this table. So we started with one for online banking portal, one for each risk statement. That was our number 1. Then we also reviewed the contributing risk assessments. Now, what's our number 2? Our number 2 major activity is other entries are exactly based on the entity hierarchy. A couple of entries are dropped in here in correlation with our entity hierarchy. So in this table, one for one every single assessed entity in the hierarchy, you would see an entry being made. So if we go back to our GRC workbench, and again, this is risk statement hierarchy, but if you remember from our entity hierarchies, over here, we can see. So what we reviewed currently is for online banking portal, but one for one for assessed entity, there should be an entry made in the table in the roll-up results. So one for retail online banking, then customer banking, and Alpha Bank. So that is what we are now going to uncover. So let's go ahead and remove these filters one by one. So we can see there's one for retail online banking, customer banking, and Alpha Bank. So we'll go ahead and remove that, and we can see these entries were dropped. How these are calculated, we are yet to explore that, how the roll-ups are calculated. But the point to be understood here is that there is one entry dropped for every assessed entity that you have in your entity hierarchy. And of course, you can click on the contributing risk assessments. So for customer banking, no surprise, there should be 2 because online banking portal rolls into customer banking. For retail banking, same thing, 2. And then for Alpha Bank, same thing, the 2, because they are all rolling up from online banking portal. So that's number 2. Now let's move on. For a brief moment, we will go back just to collapse all of this again. So we go back to our starting point. And number 3 is entries are made exactly based on the risk hierarchy. So, based on the risk hierarchy, couple of entries are dropped in here in this table, one for one for every risk statement in the risk hierarchy. So if you go back to the GRC workbench again, again, risk dependencies, risk statement hierarchy, we have these 2 risk statements which roll into channel availability, and the other is technology and cyber risk. So for one, there should be an entry dropped. So we can remove channel availability risk and technology and cyber risk and hit run. So there you go. So we have an entry made one for each of these risk statements. And again, as we view the contributing risk assessments, you would see these 2. In this case, for channel availability, so let's do that one more time. Okay, that was remote maintenance. For channel availability, yep, you should see these 2. And the same goes for technology and cyber risk. You should see 2. So now with that, now let's remove all of these filters so that we are back to just focusing on the default ones. So if I go back over here, and then again, okay, so the default ones that are going to be created are all of these. So these are what I call as default entries, meaning these entries will be created based on these three major activities that we discussed. Number one, risk assessments for assessed entity, vis-a-vis risk statement. Number two, based on your entity hierarchy. And number three, based on your risk hierarchy. And all this together is what I call as your default aggregated risk entries being made on this table. That's it. It's that simple. We'll review the fourth one in a little bit, but right now it's time for us to explore how these risk scores and ratings and ALE calculations work, what we haven't yet so far. That's the meat of risk scoring. So before we go to the fourth major activity, we will first understand this. All right. So how are these calculated, by the way? Well, it's no surprise that it's really based on RAM configurations for qualitative and quantitative rollups. Remember, recall the rollup configurations in the RAM that define the rollup strategy. That's what is at play here. We define in the operational risk RAM that quantitative as ALE is, we can go check, is average, whereas score is maximum. So let's check that in terms of rollups. So we have to view contributing risk assessments as they are governed by these contributing risk assessments are governed by the formulae that are defined in the rollup configurations of the RAM. So we'll be inspecting, let's inspect the scores, ratings, and ALE closely. We'll start with the inherent rating. So in this case, let's take an example of going back to the foundational entries, right? The number one. So again, for this remote maintenance, it's no brainer. It's basically just one assessment. So whatever we had over here as the result has mapped back. So I can close the RAM for now as and also the workbench as mapped back over here. So notice inherent rating, control effectiveness, residual rating, and target rating. Here in the table, it's called as rating, but truly speaking, it's basically your score. So if you go back to your assessment over here, this is your score. So your inherent risk, if I critical score 4, that is what you should find for remote maintenance, if I critical score 4. So here in the table, it is referred to as inherent rating. It's really, your computed inherent risk value. Control effectiveness, straightforward. What we see over here, under control effectiveness, is stored here in control effectiveness. Residual rating, again, residual risk is residual rating. Target risk is target rating. And then you have the inherent rating, control rating, residual rating, and target rating. So these four are representative of scores. When they have been transformed using the criteria, these are your rating values. These are the actual numerical score values. It's the same thing as what you see over here. It's just that it's more raw form of the score values. Then you have the ALEs, the inherent ALE, residual ALE, target ALE, these values. And again, as we noticed Over here, these ALE values, inherent ALE, residual ALE, and target ALE values have been stored. But then notice that there are several other ALE values the system proactively stores. If you need them, they are available. The system picks them up based on how your RAM configuration changes. If the RAM configuration uses a max of ALE, it picks up a max. If it uses min, it picks up a min, and so on and so forth. But it has already predetermined and stored those values. So you see average of these ALEs, maximum of these ALEs, minimum, and some of these ALEs. So same thing goes for the scores as well. So the system has proactively determined these values and stored as a reference point in case you need them. If your RAM has any updates in terms of the configurations, the values are already computed and the system will pick it up from over here automatically. All right, so now let's talk about the roll-ups. So this example was straightforward. We took one assessment. Now what happens in case of a roll-up? So let's take online banking portal. This would be a good example because they should have two assessments, right? So the roll-up, based on how we have defined the RAM, is going to pick up the value. So in case of inherent rating, which is your score, it has picked up 5 critical score 4. If you look at these two, it has picked up, looks like the greater value. So it has, the configuration is max. What is the maximum, right? So it has picked up the maximum value. Now let's take another example over here. Control effectiveness. Here we see the control effectiveness is 2, mostly effective. Score is 2.5. So we come over here and we can keep scrolling until we find control effectiveness. And again, so it is 2, mostly effective, 2.5, or the other one is 2, mostly effective, score is 2. So it looks like it has just picked up the maximum score as well in case of control effectiveness 2. When you look at the residual, there's 3, high, score is 2. So if you go back and we keep scrolling to the right until we find residual, so we see 3, high, score is 2, here 2, moderate, score is 1. So clearly it has picked up the maximum value. So really based on how the roll-up configurations are, the system picks up the values between these risk assessments. So let's continue with this. So just as a cross check, so this is the RAM, operational risk methodology, operational risk RAM. So let's look at this. So the scores are calculated as maximum. So that's based on how the RAM is configured. ALEs are based on average. So if you were to review ALE for these, you would find that these are averaged out. So for example, for online banking portal, and you can see that inherent is 2260.32. And if you review the assessments, go back to the left, it's basically 4500.45 plus 20.20 divided by 2. That's your average. So that's how the ALEs are calculated as averages, whereas the scores are picked up as maximum. Now, this is between these two risk assessments, remote maintenance and unavailability for online banking portal. The same would be applicable for everything else. So depending on the roll-up, so if this is rolling out the customer banking and you clicked on view contributing assessments, the same formulas of maximum and average would apply to score and ALEs for the risk assessments that you see over here. So it doesn't matter where you're looking at this from, at which level of the roll-up. It's the RAM configuration that really drives how those risk assessments are going to be interpreted and what values are going to be sticking at these respective roll-ups. So with that, let's continue. We have one last critical area to be investigated, which is the fourth major activity. So we have reviewed 3 out of 4 major activities, and the fourth one we have been pushing a little bit out to understand how these risk scorings are calculated and aggregated so that we can understand the fourth one more better. To make the fourth major activity easily understandable, I'm going to call this out. So the risk scores thus far cater to 2 types of audiences broadly. One is organizational leaders and the other is risk leaders. But when you need to address specific targeted stakeholders, you may create something called as report definitions that regenerate these risk scores for the exact reporting needs that those stakeholders may have. So what we are currently seeing on the screen addresses majority of organizational and risk management stakeholders. But then if you have custom reporting needs from certain stakeholders, that's where your fourth major activity comes into play. It's the same underlying data, but generated in the reporting dimensions that matter to your stakeholders. Let me explain. First, notice how the reporting definition column is empty for these records that we have reviewed thus far. It will be empty. It will stay that way because these are default risk score outputs. But if you defined your reporting needs, new records will be generated to cater to those needs, leaving alone the system default scoring records. Again, leaving alone the system default scoring records. Let's review the reporting dimensions that I have defined for one of my stakeholders, WinSettle. Then I'll cover the final layer of the onion, the risk scores. All right. So for now, we can go ahead and close some of these tabs because we have reviewed most of it. And while we are over here, we can navigate to, I'll go back to the favorites and pin this. And navigate to advanced risk assessments, administration, and aggregate risk report management. Open that in a new tab. So over here, if I filter this by the risk assessment methodology, operational risk, 4 records, one for each assessed entities over here. And this has been created by me more as a custom reporting requirement to address WinSettle's requirements. So let's investigate one of these, and the others are going to be very similar. So let's take online banking portal. So for online banking portal, WinSettle wants reports for each of these risk statement. Like, really wants to see the risk scores and ratings and ALEs, risk scores or ratings and ALEs for each of these risk statements, in context of the entity, assessed entity online banking portal. Likewise, WinSettle has given requirements for retail online banking and so on and so forth. So for each of those, these definitions have been set up. Now to reveal the fourth major activity in risk scoring, we'll navigate back to the risk assessment scores. And we'll change the filter here so that we can reveal those records. So we're going to make this as assessed entity is not empty and risk statement is not empty, and we'll run this. So we see many of these records are now revealed. Now, this is based on the reporting dimensions defined in the aggregated risk report management report definitions that we just reviewed. Based on the report definitions, these new set of records were generated, like spit out by the system so that you could slice and dice the same underlying default risk scores from different dimensions of assessable entity and risk statement together. So we can scroll to the right over here, and at the rightmost, what we will see is the report definition that generated this particular specific record, or these specific records. Another way to think about this is think of this as a flattened output of the previous three that we studied. This could be used for generating dashboards for your executives, or you may simply choose to extract this in an Excel for offline sharing with your stakeholders. This works exactly the same way as we reviewed the other three. Absolutely no difference in how these calculations work. It's the same thing. So let me just pull this up real quick. So since this works exactly the same as how we reviewed the other three, we're going to skip the part where how the scoring is generated. It's the same approach. This The RAM's roll-up configurations ultimately govern the score calculations across inherent scores, control effectiveness, residual, and target. Not only the average, maximum, minimum, and sum of the scores and ALEs are proactively generated for reference, um, regardless of the roll-up configurations. This entire output is the result of those roll-up configurations. One key call out as we wrap up our review of aggregated risk reports, notice risk roll-up status. It's updated. If you changed your roll-up configurations in the RAM, this will flip back to not updated. There is this schedule job that we reviewed, in the prerequisites, um, which runs and updates these records again, basically rerunning the entire scoring model if the records need an update on demand. Um, Finally, to conclude, in the advanced risk application, there are modules to make risk scores slash ratings and ALEs easily accessible to all risk users. Let's find that. So if we navigate to advanced risk assessments, aggregated risk reports, aggregation by risk statement, aggregation by entities, these are your default outputs that we reviewed. Entity by risk statements is this output that we have on the screen. The first two modules produce the default risk scores slash ratings and ALEs. The last module produces the risk definition based outputs, to be precise. That's it. That's advanced risk scoring simplified for you. Hopefully, this was helpful. Thanks for your attention. Let's go back to the deck and wrap up the learning session. All right. Before we wrap up, let's recap the critical points. Key takeaways. Risk scoring transforms opinions into data. Without it, you have subjective assessments. With it, you have actionable, comparable, and auditable scores. The RAM is your engine. Every scoring configuration, factors, logic, criteria, roll-ups, lives in the risk assessment methodology. Invest time here. Build bottom up, report top down. Configure factors, then assessments, then roll-ups. The data flows upward to give leadership the visibility they need. Two scoring languages, one engine. Qualitative and quantitative scoring work together. Use what fits your program maturity and stakeholder needs. Flexible calculation paths. You're not logged into one approach. Factor-driven or derived, individual controls or control environment. Configure what works for you. Roll-ups are where value is realized. Individual scores are useful. Aggregated scores across hierarchies enable strategic decision making. Um, don't skip the prerequisites. System properties, scheduled jobs, and foundational knowledge set you up for success. And finally, the ARA admin role is essential. If you're implementing risk scoring, ensure you have the right access and partnerships in place. Again, thank you for your time. Um, let's review the resources and then we'll wrap this up. So here are your references for continued learning. The top section includes documentation, community post, and ask the expert recordings covering advanced topics like risk calculation, quantitative versus qualitative ratings, roll-ups, and transformation criteria. The speed learning resources section lists the prerequisite sessions we discussed earlier: risk taxonomy, RAM 101, advanced risk assessments, and risk assessment lifecycle. At the bottom, you'll find links to partner integrations like Threat Connect for quantitative cyber risk. Bookmark this slide. These resources will support you as you implement and refine your risk scoring approach. All right, that brings us to the end of today's session on risk scoring for advanced risk assessments. We have covered a lot of ground from the foundational concepts and terminology through the RAM configurations that power scoring and the data model that makes it all work at the runtime. Remember, factors feed assessments, assessments feed rollups, and rollups deliver the enterprise visibility your stakeholders demand. If you have questions as you implement, revisit the resources slide and reach out to your AR administrators. Thank you for your time and attention. Good luck with your advanced risk assessments risk scoring journey.